Well, first, thank you to Michael for that incredibly generous introduction. And thank you to the Dallas Architecture Dallas Architecture Forum for the invitation to be here. As we were doing our tech check earlier, the list of former speakers was scrolling on the screen, and I asked Nate if it was an intimidation tactic. So also want to thank Nate Udaley and the Architecture Forum for the kind invitation to be here. I was reminded earlier today that in Dallas and Fort Worth, you have a collection, one of the most extraordinary collections of modern architecture, certainly in the United States, maybe on the planet, in these two cities. And I think that is the result of an incredibly active and committed community, one that values design and one that values architecture. And my first experience with that, with those buildings, those designed spaces, really came through two extraordinary colleagues and mentors, Rebecca Bowles and Carl Backus, and they're here tonight, so I thank them for the art marches and the architecture marches every time I come to Dallas. I'm also particularly honored to be working with some new clients who live here in Dallas, and they are here tonight. And this is a little larger room than your kitchen table where you usually hear me speak. So I'm just saying, hopefully it turns out well. Hopefully it turns out as well as when we're at your kitchen table. So I'm going to share a little bit with you tonight about our firm and a little bit about our process and how we make architecture. And as Michael very beautifully summarized in his intro, we are a firm that has been around for a very long time. And it would have been easy, I think, to have relied on showing you the kind of greatest hits that, brought our firm recognition in decades past. But I decided instead to show you things that we have that were recently completed or are currently in progress. I'm going to show you 7 projects that I think really represent the diversity of the work that we are pursuing and represents the kind of interest and attention that we give to those. And then hopefully at the end there will be a little bit of time for questions. So, to start off, we believe that at the core of what we do as architects is to make great places for people. And for us, that is the same process whether we are designing retail stores for a fruit company in New York or a private art gallery for a single person in Honolulu, Hawaii. Great civic buildings such as the City Hall in Newport Beach, California, or small neighborhood libraries such as this one in Seattle. And it really comes down to our interest in 3 things. We are so interested in the nature of people, how they see, how they perceive things, what piques their curiosity, how they play, what brings them joy. And that is a fundamental part of our design process, is thinking very, very carefully about people. We're also terribly interested in places, landscapes, and how buildings can relate to their particular landscape. Whether it is, in this case, it relates to Glacial Lake in New York State, or how they respond to the sun or the wind, how they respond to vegetation, or how they slip into the landscape in a way that maybe is deferential to that particular sense of scale and power in the landscape. And thirdly, we are interested in how we make things, which some people refer to as craft or craftsmanship. But we are really interested in the nature of materials, how materials come together, how they can be layered, what they tell you about how they like to be used. And that for us is equally fascinating, whether we're using a material like wood or whether we're using glass and stainless steel. We're interested in celebrating those connections and articulating them in a way that make them quite special. So we are one firm in 6 locations, and we work globally. And we believe and thrive on the idea of collaboration. So this is a very typical Bohlin Cywinski Jackson meeting, there might be someone sketching on printed drawings, there might be a three-dimensional physical model, we might be looking at materials, there's someone on the computer, and many, many, many more things. But we thrive on that aspect of being together and working through projects and the design process together. Our offices are structured in very similar ways in that they are in open, loft-like spaces. We don't have private offices, and they are purposefully very democratic in the way we organize our desks and the size of the desk, all those things. We think, again, that encourages collaboration and accessibility. If there was a silver lining to have that came out of the pandemic for us and for our firm, it was that it enabled us to break out of these kind of silos, regional silos that we'd been in as 6 offices, and come together as one firm, because the way in which we interacted with the firm was exactly the same. Everyone was connecting virtually. And what it did was it allowed us to have all-hands meetings for the very first time, and to see everyone's face for the very first time all together. And that prompted things like doing marketing across the entire firm, doing staffing across the entire firm. And it really served to bring us all together in a very different way than previous attempts had been. We also made a number of interesting discoveries. So for many years, we had a sketch club in the practice. We live in a land of Revit. You know, our drawings are done in Revit. We live in the land of Revit. And we have had this notion of exercising different parts of your brain. And in particular, many of the senior architects in our practice were interested in that. And so it continued during the pandemic in an even more extraordinary way, where nearly everyone in the office, in the firm, would participate. Some were timed, some were quite leisurely, but this idea of connecting more viscerally and virtually at the same time was quite interesting to us. We love a field trip. So we love nothing more than getting out in the field, and it's a way of showing younger architects and some not so young architects now how what you draw or model or are working on in the office is brought to life on the construction site. So that's an important part of our process and our design culture. You know, thinking about my own personal trajectory in this practice and as an architect, this was me in a different hair phase. There were moments where things clicked for me, and one of those, which Michael mentioned, was the visitor center that we did at Grand Teton National Park in Jackson, Wyoming. We started this project in 2001 when I was 30 years old. And it was a kind of extraordinary thing. We were hired to do a new visitor center for a park that gets between 3.5 and 4 million visitors annually. And we learned that we were hired because of our ability to do buildings that were modern but also rustic at the same time. So these 3 things I mentioned earlier, the notion of people, places, and material, this was the first time for me that it clicked in a really visceral, specific way. So we had this idea or observation that people visiting Jackson experience a very vast landscape, and we had this idea that when you came to the visitor center, it would be great to have a place that felt calm and scaled very much to the human, and that it was ordered. So we had the idea of making a courtyard. I think there is even a laser pointer here. And that the program in the building might be arrayed around the edges in more jagged geometry that would almost reflect the kind of jagged peaks of the Tetons. And the building would sit between a riparian forest and a natural sagebrush meadow, so it was kind of sitting at this middle ground between 2 landscapes. And then we also had the idea that once you came into the building, that the sense of scale would change, and that the roof would tilt up, and the kind of view would be represented. The view that you had seen driving on the highway for 50 miles would be represented to you. As I mentioned, a sort of incredible site. We're a few hundred yards from the Snake River at the southern end of the park. And the building, as I mentioned, straddles the line between a dense forest that you're immersed in when you first approach the building. And there's quite a long walk from the parking space to the building, which I think challenges some American notions of wanting to park right by the front door. But it was important to us that you decompress when you get out of your vehicle and be immersed in that landscape and in the sights and sounds and smell of the forest. And then when you come to the building, you are greeted with this courtyard that is very ordered, and it does a number of things. It feels really good if you're there as a single person or a couple, and it feels good when it's filled with people. The edges are a colonnade that protects from the hot summer sun in Wyoming and also from the heavy snowfall in the winter. And then when you step inside, the roof tilts up, and that great view of the Tetons is revealed again. There are some familiar elements that were really important to us. It was important to have a fireplace that acted as a hearth, both a physical and a kind of psychological sense of hearth. And we deliberately wove the exhibits, the interpretive exhibits, throughout this great hall. Rather than having a separate room that was a black box for exhibits, we wanted the experience to be quite seamless and in a way somewhat casual. And the exhibits take the form of uplifts, which is the geologic process that formed the Tetons themselves. You know, talking a little bit about craft, this building was one of the first that we used, worked with a timber fabricator, Spearhead Timber Works, and the entire timber structure was modeled in the computer and fabricated off-site from sustainably grown, sustainably harvested, certified timber, brought to the site in pieces, pre-cut, pre-drilled, and erected in less than 1 week. So the great kind of richness and tapestry of the building is something that we're very proud of. So leaping forward a few years, I'm going to share with you a newer project at Carnegie Mellon University. This is Ansys Hall, which was prompted by the idea of a maker space where students from different engineering disciplines would come together and work with a private company that develops robotics and modeling software. And as is sometimes the case with an urban campus, the site was rather constrained. So our site was not the parking lot in the foreground. Our site was actually the sliver of ground where you see the construction trailer and the fence. There used to be dumpsters there. So this was an invented site for this building, very much seen as an infill building among all of these historic buildings, which, by the way, none of their floors lined up either. So it was a particularly hairy challenge. One of the things we did at the very beginning was to make a diagram that did two things. We looked at existing connections between departments that would be using the building, and then we thought about what might be proposed connections that would happen as a result of this new facility. So the blue is the existing, and the orange are proposed connections that we thought might happen, including reaching out into the community to cultural and civic institutions. So kind of an interesting thing, and it got us thinking of the building as connective tissue. And this is fairly evident in the first sketch that we did for the interview, where you can see us imagining a building that is, in a way, connecting all of these disparate buildings together, as well as campus roots. So you see in red here in particular at the top of the screen, this is a campus, kind of main campus quadrangle. And this path needed to be maintained through the site on campus. There was also a significant grade change between that quadrangle and our site, and we tried to exploit that by making a high bay space at the very bottom of the building. That would be the maker space, and by bringing in the circulation actually through the middle of the building. And we did this by establishing a new bridge and walkway that threaded the needle through one of the historic arches that was in place, and then literally sliced through our building. And this did a couple of things. It brought light into those spaces, daylight into those spaces, but it also allowed people on campus who were not associated with those programs to see what was happening in the high bay space. And that's kind of an exciting thing to generate interest and enthusiasm for those particular programs. When you arrive at the kind of at the end of that sequence, you're in a plaza that's at the base of the building, and that glass kind of plinth that forms the base of the building is the makerspace. And there are garage doors that open up, and so the space can be used outdoors in nice weather. And the stadium stair allows you to also have classes and kind of hang out space outside. The interior of that space was purposefully kept quite raw. So the faculty told us that they liked the idea that it could be a workshop during the day and that they could potentially have a cocktail party with donors at night. So all the furniture is on casters, and all of the utilities kind of can get sucked up to the ceiling and then open the space to the outdoors. And the adjacent computer labs in the building and on upper levels were also, it was important to us that the students doing the fabrication in the shop be able to kind of visually be connected to the computer labs and the software. So there are direct lines of sight kind of down into those spaces. In all of our buildings, we're terribly interested in sustainability, and in particular, the notion of how a building can respond to its solar orientation. So in the diagram on the left, you can see that there's a system of vertical and horizontal fins that help to shade the glazing from the sun, as well as roof overhangs. And then we also made, as a major component of the sustainable agenda for the building, the notion of stormwater. And so there's a series of green roofs, rain gardens, and bioswales that collect the rainwater from the roof and all the surfaces of the building, and then filter it slowly before it goes back into the city system. One of the things I think our team is proudest about this building is the fact that it fits so neatly and so closely to the historic buildings that surround it. And I think one of the things that's quite successful is that we utilized the materials and some of the material palette from the historic architecture by Henry Hornbostel on campus, but interpreted it in a new kind of fresh way, so that it seems kind of both to refer to those buildings, but also have its own identity. And I think we've done that quite well in this kind of layering of more modern materials that recalls some of the construction of the historic ones. So at the same time that we were working on Ansys Hall, which is a little indicative of the different scales that we work at, we were also working on a summer cabin on a glacial lake in British Columbia. And I remember the first time that we visited this particular site with our clients. It sits on a bluff about 100 feet, 150 feet above the lake surface. And we had this feeling, the lake was very still and reflected the mountains, very peaceful, very beautiful. But we had this feeling of kind of floating in the trees above the lake. And we liked the idea of capturing that somehow in the building. And our clients asked us to kind of push things a little bit, even a little more, so that they would feel as though they were floating in the landscape above the lake. And part of our process in our firm is we do pinups every week and review kind of ongoing design with the whole office. Anyone who wants to attend is welcome. And we had presented a design for this project that actually was kind of soundly criticized by everyone in the office, which was a kind of humbling thing, but unnecessary. And so the two colleagues I was working with on the project, after we had that kind of not great presentation, we sat down and did this sketch on the left and the sketches on the right. And we're really thinking about the cabin more as a locus for activity and as the kind of linchpin in the family's daily activity, moving up and down the bluff to the dock, to the lake, and then other activities around the site. We also wanted to think about the building as responding to this incredible topography. So you can see in this section that we're on a very narrow part of a flat land between a mountain and the cliff leading down to the lake. And so the wedge shape or the sloping roof was something that evolved out of our conversations about wanting to recognize that you could look out to the lake, which was more of a horizontal view, and also up the mountain and up into the forest to kind of have the experience of seeing both things. The cabin itself is quite modest. On the plan on the lowest level, you can see is a kind of living kitchen dining that's combined. There's a little mudroom and a pantry. The stair is a saddlebag that sits outside of the main volume. The second floor has 2 bedrooms and 1.5 baths to share. And then the third level has a loft space for bunks. The approach side at the road, we kept purposefully a little vague and a little obscure. The clients were concerned about inviting people to explore around the site, and so we very, very purposefully kept the elevation rather flat. But the trellis is really the element that kind of draws you towards not only the front door, but also towards the views of the lake, and it angles to the south, which is where the better views happen. The cabin's primarily used in the summer, and so the kitchen space opens directly to the patio, which is where they have their dining tables set up most of the time. And the joists, the structure that supports the loft inside, actually becomes the elements of the trellis outside. We used very modest materials here, plywood for the cabinets, stained plywood on the island, and porcelain tile on the floor. And then as you look towards the lake, there's a wall of glass that opens up directly to that view. We were really inspired, we've been inspired for a long time by Scandinavian buildings that have a dark exterior that kind of camouflage them into the forest, and the interior being quite warm and have the warmth of the clear finish wood. And we like the contrast between the two. We purposefully carved away the corner of the living room to take advantage of those southern views of the lake, so it isn't totally a symmetrical view, as I showed in the previous image. And it's become a favorite spot for the family to hang out and catch those long kind of linear views of the lake. As I mentioned, the stair sits outside of the main volume and has glass at both ends, so you can see the lake when you're going down and the mountains and the forest as you're going up the stair. And then there are some kind of more intimate moments where we made a cabinet that becomes a window seat for the couple. So sometimes at a very modest scale and with some simple materials, you can make something of great power. The next project I'm going to share is another makerspace building, but with a very different circumstance. So unlike the alleyway that became the site for the Carnegie Mellon project, Ansys Hall, this is a project at the University of Illinois that has an extraordinarily open and prominent site. It sits at the end of what they call the military axis, at the end of a very long campus quadrangle, the bell tower at the center, and their campus library is this octagonal building here at the upper right-hand part of the image. So our site, which was here at the terminus of that before the more residential neighborhood, occupies this kind of building in the round, or it became a kind of idea of a building in the round. So we had an interesting response to their program. The master plan originally called for a 4-story building, and we decided that because of the collaborative notion of a makerspace building, it should really be 2 levels. And to keep everybody closer together, that getting to 4 floors would begin to segregate activities. And so we convinced the university that they should condense to two floors. And then we split the building into 2 wings, the idea being that you would connect to that quadrangle and to the campus more directly if the center of the building opened up to it. And then the third component is that we and the university decided to explore universal accessibility. They were interested in being a leader, in being at the forefront of that. And so every space in the building is accessible through a series of ramps. So there isn't a grand stair, but rather there's a grand ramp that occupies the central atrium that links all of the spaces together and encompasses gathering spaces for the students. So here you see the floor plan. The areas in light blue are the kind of shop spaces, classroom spaces, fabrication zones, and the space in the center that I mentioned before that kind of winds down to the lower level, that is a series of ramps, is here. There's a porch that looks out onto the campus green. And then the lower level, there is an area at the base of the ramp that becomes a gathering space and another classroom, and then again a series of shop spaces. I love this section of this building because I think it responds directly to the ideas of how you bring light into the lower level of the building. So through a series of skylights, clerestories, and there's an angled glass skirt around the perimeter of the building that brings light into all of those lower level spaces, as well as tuning overhangs in particular places where you might have sun in the summer. So we're shading and also welcoming sun in at the same time, different times of the year rather. The longitudinal section, I think, shows this notion of how you make a building where accessibility is really at the forefront and you have this long, gentle way of circulating through the building. So this is the exterior that faces the neighborhood. So the scale of the building here is rather modest. And then once you're inside, the areas for collaboration are characterized by the clear finished wood, the ceiling, and the floor. And then you can see that center space as the ramps wind down through the building and how it's used by the students, as well as offering these kind of sideways glimpses into the classroom spaces that are on both sides. As I mentioned before, one of the floors is submerged below grade, and so there's this angled glass skirt around the perimeter that really floods those lower levels with daylight. And returning to the main level again, you can see that direct connection to the campus iconic bell tower. And there it is, all lit up at night. So, bouncing again to a residential project, this was the first time I'd ever met anyone from Tasmania. So our clients are from Tasmania, and it's not Australia. They're very clear about that. It's not Australia. And this is located in Canmore, Alberta, which is quite close to Banff. It's about an hour's drive west from Calgary. And our clients were drawn to this particular place because they are mountaineers, mountain climbers, and hiking enthusiasts. And they really liked the idea that they could be so close to the mountains and actually see the mountains from their particular property. So their site is here in a rather dense residential neighborhood. They actually had 2 lots next to each other, but with neighbors on both sides and neighbors across the street. And when we first visited the site with them, this is our rental car, there's a veil of trees, of aspen trees and evergreen trees at the street, so it's somewhat private. And then as you go deeper into the site, you were faced with this 7-meter tall rocky bank that was filled with existing trees, and I thought, well, that's sort of interesting. But then when you get to the top of that bank, there are these extraordinary views of the Canadian Rockies, which was why they were interested in the site. So the diagram on the upper right represents what the code will allow you to do, to build. And you get a bonus if you put a gabled roof on. You get a height bonus. They give you a height increase. No discussion of the fact that this bank was solid rock with about 2 inches of topsoil on it in most places. And, our approach in thinking about making a house for mountain climbers, who were not worried about a stair, by the way, or multiple stairs, was to separate the building into 2 volumes, one that responded to the lower terrain and one that sat on top of the upper terrain and retained this forest and the bank in the middle and just made a link which became a bridge and kind of a cut in the one soft spot in the rock. So the plan evolved kind of in an interesting way. There is a carport and a garage. He likes a carport, she likes a garage, so they're both happy. The entry is here at grade, and there's a stair and a mudroom. So the stair takes you up to the second level, which is where there are 2 guest bedrooms, one of which they use as an office or a study. And then a bridge that takes you to a second stair that goes up to the main living level, which is where their bedroom is, and then kitchen, dining, and living. And the angles are quite deliberate. They are aimed towards particular views of their favorite peaks. And that's the section. So looking at the finished house, you can see we retained the veil of trees at the street. There's a very narrow driveway that takes you into a space where you can begin to see the house as it terraces up the hill. The lower volume that has 2 bedrooms, guest bedrooms, one of which they use as an office, is here. Her favorite color is red, so there's a red handrail and some red accents throughout the house. This shutter enables you to open the guest room to the stair or close it for privacy. And then this is her study space, office space, with an outdoor kind of covered balcony, and we've used perforated metal as the material for the guardrail and the handrail. They have 3 cats who were very active in the design process. You can see one there in the corner, and they liked the idea of the perforated metal because it allowed the cats to look outside but didn't have reflections like glass where they might be confused. The bridge, the bridge, as you turn and head towards the upper volume, has this moment where you sense the forest and the space between the 2 volumes, and we really like that you get that moment between the 2 of connecting with the outdoors and the exterior. And then as you begin moving up the second stair to the uppermost level, you begin to see those mountain views and the mountain peaks in the distance. The bridge and the primary bedroom suite have planted roofs. The other roofs are obviously sloped. So once you reach the upper level, the roof, again, cants up, allowing you to see the tops of those peaks that they're so fond of and fond of climbing. And then when you look down the length of the kitchen, dining, living room, you're looking right down the Bow River Valley towards the mountains in the distance. The wall on the left we called it a working wall, is a combination of coffee bar, storage, window seat, and then as it moves outside, it's storage for their patio furniture. And then looking back from the main living space down, you can see all the different parts of the building connect. You can maybe understand why we call it hill climb. We are very fortunate to have a project happening in your city right now. As Michael mentioned, we were selected to do a new building at the Green Hill School. And I had the great opportunity to visit it today, so I'm going to share some very recent construction photos with you too. But one of the things that was really interesting to us had this beautiful campus, some of which is designed by O'Neill Ford, that had these cloistered, outdoor walkways and courtyards that really allowed a kind of in-between climate between the conditioned interior spaces and the often warm and humid exteriors. And then this interest in natural materials and bringing daylight into classroom spaces was a kind of pattern or precedent on the campus. So our building anchors a kind of important corner on the campus and in quite close proximity to 2 existing buildings. But it has a very straightforward and a little deceptive plan. So the red spaces are math and science, and they kind of occur on the perimeter on both floors. And then there is a kind of fabrication zone of shop spaces and maker spaces in this building. And then there's a great commons that surrounds a courtyard that's internal. And then there's a great outdoor space here, and there's a 100-year oak, beautiful heritage oak tree here that we're retaining that was a kind of important part of the overall composition of the building. And then, as you can see, the building connects quite closely to some existing classroom buildings on campus. But it was really the section that started to get us kind of excited. We and the school explored the idea of making a very sustainable building, and were interested in using mass timber and cross-laminated timber, or CLT. And so it really became a kind of exercise in section of how to bring light into these spaces while also keeping them comfortable for the students and the faculty. So I'm going to share with you some of the renderings for the project. This is looking past and through the 100-year oak into this kind of commons alongside the makerspace. The building has two natures. It has kind of a hard outer shell that is brick. We're using a brick that is used throughout their campus. And you can see the sawtooth shapes are bringing in north light into all the upper level classrooms. And these shrouds on the windows are helping to shade the glazing, and they're different depending on the orientation of the building. That's looking back through the portal towards the heritage oak. And then this is looking into what we think of as the main entrance, although the building has many entrances, into that kind of commons space. There's a big seating stair for collaboration. It has skylights, and you're adjacent to this beautiful internal courtyard. So these are some very recent photos taken earlier today of the building under construction. They're hoping to be done later this fall. But what a wonderful thing to use mass timber and CLT as a way of reducing the building's carbon footprint. And exposing all of that on the interior, we think also provides a great learning opportunity, teaching opportunity for the next generation of people. Sometimes you get the chance to revisit projects that you've done in the past. This is one of those projects. About 15 years ago, we designed a house for a music producer on the San Juan Islands, in the San Juan Islands, rather north and west of Seattle. This is Henry Island, which is one of the islands that does not have any ferry service. So to get there, you either take a boat or a plane to the main island, and then you take a charter across, being very careful of the tides. So the original building, which we call the main residence, was built utilizing a series of prefabbed elements and shop fabricated elements that were brought to the site on this barge that could only access the site at high tide, which I'll speak about in a moment. But a kind of classic Northwest landscape, beautiful deep evergreen forest, kind of pebbly beach, beautiful clear water in the bay. And the original house, the owners really liked the idea of making it feel like a camp. It's a remote place. They liked the idea that it felt very rustic, and so we separated the living dining kitchen spaces from the bedrooms with this breezeway. So you walked outside, it was covered between meals and hanging out and sleeping. And it turned out to be the favorite part of the client when he was there, and he also always liked hanging out in that breezeway. So here on the right, you see the living dining kitchen space where the roof tilts up towards the fireplace on the right-hand side. And then the bedrooms are arrayed on the left. You can see the building is lifted up on columns, which was a way of minimizing the amount of concrete foundations that we were doing because it's difficult to get concrete truck to the island. And they were thought of as a kit of parts. So you see the steel columns and beams and wood panels and glass panels that formed the walls. So as sometimes happens, the owner went through some life changes and decided to sell the building and property. And it sat vacant for several years. And then one day, the new owners called us and said they had found our drawing set in the mechanical room of the cabin. And they wondered if we would help them renovate the main residence because it had been sitting empty for a few years and they wanted to make some changes. They were a young family with 2 small boys. And through the process of conversation, we came to understand that they were intending to spend lots of time there in the summer, weeks, if not months at a time, with members of their extended family. And they felt that they needed a little more space. And rather than adding on to the existing building, they envisioned this idea of taking the idea of a camp one step further to a series of smaller buildings on the property. And so working with them, we came up with the idea that you would come to the dock in your boat, and most of the time you come up through the forest on this driveway and then back to the main residence and the view of the water. The reason for that is there's a wetland here that is not easily traversed. We had this idea that you might do a little boardwalk here along the edge of the wetland, and that was roundly or soundly refused by the county due to the environmental concerns. So the notion was that you come up through the forest where you might encounter a workshop building and garage. So there are no cars on the island, but they have a series of ATVs and lots of gear, canoes, kayaks, paddleboards, etc. So they wanted a space where they could store those. And then they wanted to do a guest house with 2 guest suites, and then a bunkhouse, which eventually turned into more of a little kind of activities and hangout pavilion that we call the Game Shack. But the idea was that we would take the weathering steel material palette from the main residence and think of that as a way of linking all of those buildings together. We sort of thought of it as a wagon train of sorts. And I'm going to share with you today the guest house. So when you come out of the forest, you arrive at the guest house, and we were really inspired by the breezeway on the main residence, but we wondered if we could take it even a step further. So we had this idea that you could make a living room space or a hangout space between the 2 bedroom suites, and it could be totally open, or it could have walls of insect screen or walls of glass that pocket away. So we tried to make a space that felt like a porch but could be enclosed if they wanted it to. And one of the things that I enjoy about the building is that it sits on a slope. So the bedrooms have very different natures. One of them nestles into the grade, and the other one floats above the grade. So the building kind of emerges from the landscape in that way. And on the image on the right, you can see is the upper bedroom that tucks into the landscape. It had to have a special relationship to the main residence as well. So here you can see the main residence with the planted roof and the walls of weathered steel in the distance, and how that porch or open space breezeway in the middle relates to it. The structure is a slender steel pipe columns with back-to-back channels that support a raft of wood. And then the windows and doors and cabinets and walls are all arrayed below that. You know, I mentioned earlier, we take this notion of craft and craftsmanship very seriously. And on this project, we had a build partner who was exceptional, and I think took that notion and that vision even more seriously than we did. And the image on the left is one of my favorites because I think it demonstrates the precision with which the building was constructed. And, you know, it's terribly difficult to have all of these things meet in one particular place. And I think they did that in a way that made it seem effortless. We also had the opportunity to design the interiors and select the furniture and even design some pieces of furniture. So this is a coffee table that we designed of steel plate and white oak. As I mentioned, the bedrooms have different natures. The one that floats above the landscape has a window seat and a deck outside. And the one that's tucked into the earth has a deck that's more at grade and has a concrete ledge and has a more intimate relationship with the forest and the existing trees. Sometimes when you do everything right and the stars align, you can make a little magic. And this building is one that feels as though it really resonates within its place. The last project that I'm going to share with you tonight is one that's kind of close to my heart because it's about wine. And we were very fortunate to be selected to work with Camus Vineyards. You know, it's a family business, multi-generational family business. And they're very committed to not only the quality of the wine, but the experience of tasting the wine. And, you know, many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with California's wine regions and Napa and Sonoma, and they were interested in, I guess colonizing is the right word, a new wine region in the Sassoon Valley, and maybe bringing people to a less populated place where they can have maybe a more intimate relationship with the wine and with the landscape and the winemaking process. So the pink is our site, and it's a valley that sits right at the foot of some incredible mountains, which you'll see in a moment. And the existing buildings there are all of a kind of agricultural nature that have these long, low horizontal lines that are more about the horizon. And so that was part of the inspiration for our scheme. So early on, we had the concept of making multiple buildings. One that would be a building that greeted you when you came to the site, which here is called a retail building. And then a separate building that was for tasting the wine, and that there would be a journey that you would take between the two outdoors to be, again, kind of immersed in the landscape. And the idea was to make those two buildings feel quite different. So you can see in our drawing, the retail building, the kind of reception building, was thought of as a more massive thing with solid walls, very dense. And the building that would be where you taste the wine was thought of as a pavilion that was rather open to the landscape. So I'll kind of take you on this experience through the site, but you come to a building that is made of ground face concrete block, exposed wood beams, and has a very tough kind of metal, standing seam metal exterior, very modestly scaled, very intimate. And that's what you're greeted with. There's a espresso bar for those of you who need a little pick-me-up before the wine tasting experience, and then some restrooms. But we thought about how the light would come in, but it was thought of as always as a kind of protected place, shaded place. And there's also a temperature-controlled space where they sell their wine that you can either stop on your way in or on your way out to purchase the wine you've tasted. But it's really as you leave this building and you approach the tasting room that you begin to see something that feels quite extraordinary. The tasting room has 3 zones. It has a space in the center, which is a more casual experience where you can just walk in without an appointment and hang out and taste wine. And then at each end, there are rooms, spaces for private tastings that can have large groups or events. So the idea is that both of those things could happen at the same time. The center of the main space is characterized by this oculus that brings light down from above. And we detailed it a little bit to be like a James Turrell light sculpture. We were really inspired by him. I was telling someone earlier that our experience doing projects for Apple in particular and other clients who were interested in pushing the limits of engineering have given us the license and the experience to make extraordinary cantilevers and spaces. We work with great engineers, and you just need a little more steel. So those spaces at the end really open up to the landscape, and in this part of California in particular, that notion of kind of blurring the boundary between indoors and outdoors is really quite special. So Michael hinted at this earlier. It was 15 years ago that Peter Bohlin was invited to speak here at the Dallas Architecture Forum, and in the introduction, a wonderful architect named Ed Baum wrote one of what I think is one of the best quotes about our firm ever, and so it has had this extra life beyond that time across 15 years, and I'm going to read it, so bear with me. Any individual or group that is this good this long has found the secret of self-renewal, a dream we all have and that few of us achieve. I suspect the answer lies in a deep curiosity about the world and about architecture. Curiosity about how things work, how they go together, how they communicate. Curiosity keeps us actively seeking, not just responding, welcomes change and challenge as raw material for thinking and working. I don't think curiosity killed the cat at all. I think curiosity gave the cat its 9 lives. So the part of this quote that resonates with me tonight, I think, is the part about self-renewal. My partners and I are part of a 3rd generation of leadership at Bohlin Cywinski Jackson, and that was part of the reason I wanted to show you the work tonight and not rely maybe necessarily on some of the projects we've done in the past. It was to show you kind of what we're up to at this moment in time. We are really optimistic about the future and looking forward to the future, whatever it may bring. And please stay tuned. There's a lot more to come. Thank you so much.